I think the first major thing in the book here, Karan, is their story of how they raised their first fund. And they start this Blackstone group. They wanted to do like be an advisory company and advise companies on merger and acquisitions and make fees. But then at some point, early on they thought, you know what, we're going to do more than that. We're also going to raise money and invest it. So, did you like that story of them going over to Japan, going across the world, taking a couple years to figure out to find people who would give them real money, and then it seemed like they finally found some investors through insurance companies in Japan, which I guess in the late 80s, a bunch of money was in Japan.
I
And
think they got Prudential first, right, in the US, and
yeah,
then
Prudential as well. Yep.
yeah. So I think that's something that you really enjoyed in terms of how they raised their first fund. I know you mentioned you really liked how they got the Japanese investors and then kicked everything off. I think that's about you mentioned that you had enjoyed. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to be immensely wealthy one day, Karan, and I study people who've achieved great wealth, and I've found a theme, and sometimes that theme is compounding capital at 20%, 15% for a gazillion years, and you end up with a bunch of wealth. But oftentimes that theme is compounding capital at 20, 15% alongside raising a bunch of money from investors. And you go down the line, Munger, Buffett, some of the investors we follow today, um, Blackstone, all these people who've made billions and billions, almost every time they've done it through raising money and investing other people's money alongside theirs. And then because they're working with bigger sums, when they compound that capital, it turns into real money. The one guy, literally the one person who I've heard of becoming like a billionaire without any outside money is the investor from India that Monish just talked about, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala. Apparently he did it all on his own and ended up with $4 billion or something like that. But I thought that was interesting, and I'm kind of very tuned into that these days. Like, okay, someone's rich. Okay, tell me where they raised their money when they started. And I think my key takeaway from that story in this book key takeaways were it's really hard to raise money. These guys had reputations. The Peterson guy had worked in Nixon's White House as a commerce secretary. He had connections all over the world. But despite that, and despite their track record, it still took them a couple years to raise serious amounts of money.
Yeah.
So, and they talk about how they were dejected sometimes during that those travels, and they had rough meetings where they would work hard to show up somewhere, and it would be hot, and they'd walk in their suits across town, and then they'd go up into the meeting, and the people would look at them across the table, the pension fund, and they'd say, "Oh, we're never going to invest with you. We just thought it'd be interesting to talk to you," or stories like that. So it's really hard. The second thing takeaway was don't give up, because if you do get to the other side of that rainbow and you do raise the money, amazing things can happen. And if you try really hard, it's a big world with a lot of money out there, Karan, and someone might want to invest in you. And I thought that was inspiring because, Karan, this whole thing, Blackstone, $90 billion company, $100 billion business, whatever it is, individuals having billions and billions of dollars. For me, all of that started with the Japanese insurance companies and Prudential. Like, that's
True.
all it took. All it took was a couple investors believing in them, and then they did smart things along the way and invested. But because they had that big base to start with, it was kind of like, even though they had some dips in the late 80s and 90s and stuff, times got tougher, it was still basically an upward track, all because they were able to raise that money. So I found that story to be really inspiring, and that really stuck with me.
And it's the importance of, I think, what I picked up on is like having locked up capital, like you see with
Yes.
these private equity companies. And in the past, like I've heard videos of Buffett where he kind of criticizes this idea of private equity kind of they lock up money for 10 years. So if someone is able to raise like, I don't know, $1 billion fund, then they have like 10 million guaranteed, if they're charging like a fee of 1%, and suppose they're adding on maybe 20% carried interest on that. Like over 10 years, they're going to make enough that, they
can't
don't have
lose.
to work.
Yeah.
Their children don't have to work. Children's children don't have to work. Like the fee kind of takes care of the entire company and stuff. So that's a big contrast that I at least noticed. I mean, it is good that they're able to raise so much money, but there was one chapter in this book which was like, are they really value investors or just quick buck artists, value builders or quick buck artists?
Mhm.
And that chapter was really interesting to me because of what you just mentioned. Like, although they did raise some money initially, they have kind of contributed in a way to the economy. They've built something out of the capital that they had. Like, they wouldn't be such a big company if they weren't doing something positive, right? So
Well, yeah, I mean, it's capitalism. Like these guys, yeah, they did borrow a bunch of money and they were investing other people's money to a large extent, but they were also investing their money. And when they go out there and buy a business and take it off the market and take it private, they're not interested in losing money. Like they want to make things work. And sometimes that means cutting jobs. Um, but the guy gives examples at the end of the book, like example after example of where they took a company, made it leaner, made
yeah,
it a company that could actually survive tough times, and then the company thrives. That's good for the overall society. And the guy made a great point. Like, and it's a great point because look what's going on now with the big tech companies firing people. Private equity companies are not the only companies that fire portfolio companies. They're not the only businesses that have layoffs. Like public companies do that all the time too. So there's nothing that's unique to them about that.
there's somewhere between like activists and kind of a Buffett monger, where it's like they're involved in the business, but they're also going to start trimming a lot of the fat that's there in the company. So
Well, they have more control than the public equity investors like you and I and Buffett. And
true.
even Buffett obviously has more control because he can buy Berkshire can buy 15% of Paramount. No one's talking about that, but just throw that out there, Karan. They can influence companies a lot more than we can. But of course, when you go buy a company fully, you have full control.